we find ourselves dissecting the curious, deeply self-inflicted tragedy of a woman who clawed her way from the smog-choked fringes of the Los Angeles entertainment industry to the ancient, hallowed halls of Windsor, only to inevitably find herself, years later, peddling bespoke jams, rather tragic slip dresses, and mocked Californian wine from a gilded Montecito exile, all while bitterly pointing the finger of blame at the very prince who handed her the world on a silver platter. It is a spectacular, almost Shakespearean unraveling that we are witnessing in real time, my friends, a saga of boundless ambition meeting the immovable object of reality, leaving behind a trail of severed family ties, cancelled Netflix contracts, and a deeply fractured monarchy. To truly comprehend how a moderately successful cable actress managed to captivate a deeply vulnerable royal, isolate him from his lifelong support system, and ultimately orchestrate a disastrous commercial empire that has left Hollywood executives running for the hills, we must go back to the very beginning. We must bypass the carefully curated PR spin and the glossy, tear-stained interviews to examine the genesis of this insatiable hunger for the spotlight. It requires us to look closely at the formative years of Meghan Markle, a period defined not by the polished glamour she so desperately craves today, but by the quiet, persistent insecurity of a girl forever looking through the glass, pressing her nose against a world of wealth and adoration that she felt was her absolute birthright to possess. The atmosphere of her childhood in Los Angeles was a peculiar dichotomy, a world steeped in the mechanics of illusion yet fundamentally grounded in middle-class reality, providing the perfect incubator for a profound, simmering resentment. Growing up in the shadow of the Hollywood sign, one is constantly fed the toxic narrative that fame is the ultimate currency. And for a young Meghan, the smog-choked, competitive pressure of the city acted as a relentless engine for her aspirations. She was situated agonizingly close to the glittering epicenter of the entertainment industry, yet she remained firmly on its periphery, a geographical and social positioning that instills a very specific, sharp-elbowed kind of hunger in a child. She was not the offspring of A-list royalty, but rather the daughter of Thomas Markle, a hard-working, talented, yet decidedly blue-collar television lighting director who practically worshipped the ground she walked on. This proximity to stardom, without actually possessing the accompanying wealth or elite status, created a psychological pressure cooker, forging an inner monologue defined by a burning desire to be elevated from the mundane and recognized as inherently special, a narrative she has aggressively peddled ever since. Before we look closer at the true motives at play here, do ensure you are subscribed to the channel. As seasoned observers of this institution, we know the real story is rarely the one handed to the press. It is utterly impossible to decipher the Duchess's current, rather tragic scramble for relevance without deeply analyzing the profound influence of those early days spent wandering the sound stages of Hollywood under the watchful, doting eye of her father. For a deeply impressionable young girl, a television set is a dangerously seductive false home, a place where reality is entirely constructed, emotions are scripted for maximum impact, and the lighting is artificially manipulated to make everyone look infinitely better than they do in the harsh light of day. Thomas Markle, by all accounts, poured every ounce of his energy and financial resources into cultivating his daughter's ambitions, paying for elite private schooling and ensuring she had every conceivable advantage, setting a dangerous precedent that she was the absolute center of the universe. A long-time family acquaintance has often noted the suffocating devotion he exhibited, suggesting that his endless accommodations fostered a deeply ingrained expectation within her that men exist primarily to facilitate her desires and shield her from the mundane struggles of ordinary life. This environment taught her, from a remarkably tender age, how to navigate a world of actors and producers, observing the transactional nature of Hollywood, where smiles are currency, charm is a weapon, and people are invariably judged by their absolute utility to one's own upward trajectory. Beneath the confident, assertive veneer that she presents to the world, the psychological padding of her youth reveals a quiet, pervasive insecurity, the heavy emotional baggage of a child navigating a highly polarized society obsessed with neat categorizations, which further fueled her desperate need to assert control over her own narrative. While she has frequently utilized her racial heritage as a convenient shield against legitimate criticism in recent years, during her formative years, it likely contributed to a profound feeling of being an outsider, an observer looking in on established cliques and power structures that she was desperate to conquer. This internal conflict, the desperate, clawing need to be universally adored, paired with the creeping fear of not being quite enough, manifested in an intense, almost frightening drive to curate a flawless public persona. She learned to mask her vulnerabilities with a terrifyingly polished facade, developing a chameleon-like ability to mirror the expectations of those in power, a skill that would later prove absolutely devastatingly effective when she set her sights on a lonely, grieving prince. Her inner monologue became a relentless drumbeat of self-promotion, a constant strategizing on how to angle herself into the right photographs, associate with the right peers, and meticulously construct a glittering, impenetrable armor of perceived moral superiority. We must, of course, address the famous, tirelessly repeated origin myth of her feminist awakening, the celebrated letter to Procter & Gamble regarding the sexist dish soap commercial, a story she wields like a sacred relic of her own preordained greatness. To the discerning observer, and certainly to those of us who have watched her subsequent manipulations with a cynical eye, this event is less a testament to a child's spontaneous, fiery activism, and rather more indicative of a highly orchestrated PR victory crafted with heavy parental assistance. It was Thomas Markle's industry connections and deep understanding of media optics that undoubtedly facilitated the television cameras arriving to interview his fiercely ambitious 11-year-old daughter, laying the absolute groundwork for her lifelong obsession with performing virtue on a public stage. A source within the inner circle has suggested that even then, the narrative was heavily massaged to position her as a prodigy of social justice, teaching her the invaluable, dangerous lesson that adopting the correct, progressive causes is the most efficient shortcut to securing unearned public adulation. It was the genesis of a pattern we see glaringly today, wrapping entirely self-serving ambition in the impenetrable, sanctimonious cloak of global humanitarianism, a tactic she uses to sell overpriced lifestyle goods under the laughable guise of female empowerment. As she transitioned from the protective, stage-managed bubble of her Los Angeles youth to the broader horizons of university life, the long-term consequences of this unique upbringing began to sharply crystallize, fundamentally altering how she viewed human relationships. She had absorbed the ruthless, transactional ethos of Hollywood deeply into her marrow, developing an instinctual, almost predatory ability to assess the precise value of the individuals who entered her orbit. Friendships, romantic entanglements, and familial bonds were no longer viewed as organic, lifelong commitments based on mutual affection, but rather as stepping stones on a steep, treacherous climb toward an undefined apex of fame and societal influence. Those who could elevate her status, provide access to exclusive networks, or flatter her immense ego were meticulously cultivated and charmed, while those who had outlived their usefulness or dared to challenge her meticulously crafted self-image were discarded with a breathtaking, chilling coldness. This devastating pattern of ruthlessly shedding her past, which would eventually culminate in the heartbreaking public estrangement from the very father who bankrolled her ascent, the sudden abandonment of her first husband, and the spectacular severing of Prince Harry's lifelong ties, was firmly established long before she ever set foot on a yacht or a royal balcony. The die was unequivocally cast by the time she stepped out into the world as an aspiring actress, armed with a moderately impressive degree, an absolutely staggering sense of entitlement, and an insatiable hunger that no amount of ordinary success could ever hope to satisfy. She understood, with the cold clarity of a veteran Hollywood operator, that raw talent is often secondary to the sheer, relentless force of will, networking, and the aggressive marketing of oneself as a premium brand. The young girl who once watched the glittering facade of television production from the sidelines was now determined to force her way into the center frame, absolutely convinced of her own destiny to be a globally recognized leading lady, regardless of the emotional cost to those around her. It is this specific, terrifyingly focused ambition, incubated in the smoggy valleys of California and nurtured by a father's tragic overindulgence, that set her on a direct collision course with the most famous, deeply traditional family on the face of the planet. As we pull back the velvet curtain on her adult foray into the unforgiving machinery of the entertainment industry, We are met not with the overnight success story she so frequently attempts to project, but rather with the grueling, decidedly unglamorous reality of a struggling actress rapidly approaching her expiration date in a town that trades exclusively in youth. The transition from the pampered, heavily stage-managed environment of her father's television sets to the brutal, soul-crushing cattle call auditions of Los Angeles must have been a profoundly jarring shock to her notoriously fragile ego, forcing her to confront the absolute limits of her own theatrical talents. We must deeply consider the immense psychological toll of standing on the brightly lit soundstage of a daytime game show, encased in a suffocatingly tight dress and heavy false eyelashes, clutching a numbered briefcase, while acutely aware that her grand, sweeping ambitions were entirely at odds with this deeply commodified, frequently humiliating reality. Her inner monologue during this era was undoubtedly a toxic, simmering cocktail of seething frustration and cold, calculating desperation, a terrifying realization that the sands of time were slipping rapidly through her fingers, while younger, perhaps naturally more gifted starlets were effortlessly securing the leading roles she believed were her absolute divine right. It is precisely in this crucible of professional rejection and marginalized visibility that she honed her most formidable and arguably her only true talent, the ruthless, unyielding art of the hustle, realizing that if raw acting prowess was not going to propel her to the stratosphere of the global A-list, she would have to meticulously engineer her ascent through entirely different, far more transactional avenues. This desperate, calculated pivot from relying on theatrical ability to aggressively leveraging social connections brings us directly to the heavily perfumed, dimly lit corridors of Soho House, an environment that served as the absolute perfect hunting ground for a woman armed with weaponized charm and a devastatingly clear agenda. The atmosphere of these exclusive, heavily gate-kept membership enclaves is notoriously superficial, a gilded, velvet-lined snake pit where every single interaction is a carefully calculated assessment of a person's net worth, their social utility, and the potential for mutually beneficial, ruthless exploitation. It was within this specific, suffocatingly pretentious milieu that she truly came into her own, systematically transforming herself from a minor, largely unrecognized actress into a relentless, highly efficient networking machine, desperately cultivating friendships with absolutely anyone who possessed a modicum of influence, wealth, or access to the inner sanctums of true power. One can easily imagine the sheer, exhausting psychological effort required to maintain this perpetually dazzling, entirely artificial facade, the inner strain of constantly performing a hyper-curated version of oneself, forever laughing at the right jokes, mirroring the political opinions of the powerful, and ruthlessly cataloguing the weaknesses of those around her for future leverage. This was not a period of profound artistic discovery or genuine organic human connection, my friends, but rather a cold, highly calculated military campaign to embed herself within the global elite, a relentless social clambering that required her to entirely suppress any authentic emotional vulnerability in favor of a polished, impenetrable armor of strategic ambition. It is precisely within the murky, morally ambiguous waters of this aggressive networking era that we must confront the persistent, rather unseemly whispers that have relentlessly dogged her reputation. The scandalous rumors that she was entirely willing to traverse the globe to secure her proximity to the ultra-wealthy. Let us speak plainly about the so-called yachting allegations, a phenomenon perfectly understood in elite circles where impossibly glamorous, financially ambitious young women are purportedly flown to the Mediterranean to decorate the sun-drenched decks of billionaires' vessels, serving as highly decorative, socially fluid, and fundamentally entirely disposable companions. A source behind closed doors has long indicated that while the absolute, verifiable truth of her specific personal involvement in these shadowy nautical escapades remains fiercely protected by ironclad non-disclosure agreements and the collective, terrified silence of the elite, the sheer persistence of the rumors speaks absolute volumes about the aggressive, unapologetic nature of her social climbing. The atmosphere aboard these floating, multi-million-pound palaces of excess is one of extreme, almost suffocating privilege mixed with a deeply transactional undertone. A bizarre, isolated environment where a struggling actress could rub shoulders with Russian oligarchs, Silicon Valley tech titans, and minor European royalty, soaking up their immense influence while simultaneously recognizing her own deeply precarious position among them. Whether she was merely an enthusiastic, highly opportunistic guest, enjoying the endless flow of free vintage champagne, or actively leveraging these opulent environments to secure her next crucial stepping stone, the overarching reality is that she deliberately immersed herself in a world where human beings are frequently and casually treated as luxurious commodities, a brutal lesson she clearly internalized and later applied to the ruthless management of her own, fiercely guarded personal brand. The long-term consequences of this grueling, frequently humiliating decade, spent desperately knocking on the locked doors of the global elite, manifested in a profound, incredibly heavy chip on her shoulder, an agonizing internal wound that no amount of subsequent royal titles, multi-million-dollar Netflix contracts, or sycophantic magazine covers could ever truly heal. Deep within her psyche, behind the blindingly white smile and the rehearsed humanitarian platitudes, she harbors the terrifying, unshakable knowledge of exactly how hard she had to hustle, how many unsavory compromises she had to make, and how frequently she was dismissed as entirely unremarkable by the very establishment she so desperately, feverishly sought to conquer. This acute, lingering awareness of her own manufactured, deeply transactional ascent birthed an insatiable, almost pathological need to completely rewrite her own history, to furiously demand an unearned intellectual and moral respect from a public that fundamentally sees straight through her meticulously constructed, hollow facade. Her current, frequently mocked posturing as a feminist icon, a philanthropic powerhouse, and a global thought leader is not merely a cynical branding exercise designed to sell overpriced jars of jam, but rather a desperate, profound psychological defense mechanism designed to permanently wash away the lingering, undeniable stain of her years spent opening briefcases and aggressively networking in the dimly lit corners of exclusive clubs. She absolutely requires the world to view her as a woman of profound substance and historical importance, precisely because she spent the most formative, energetic years of her adult life surviving in a deeply superficial ecosystem that valued her exclusively for her decorative utility and her sheer, unadulterated persistence. The absolute climax of this relentless, exhausting hustle was, of course, securing her role on the legal drama, a moderate, perfectly adequate cable television success that provided her with a steady, respectable income, but fundamentally failed to deliver the earth-shattering, universally acknowledged global adulation she had been chasing since her childhood in Los Angeles. Relocating to Toronto, far removed from the genuine, pulsating epicenter of Hollywood power, she found herself an undeniably wealthy, moderately recognized woman, yet still agonizingly relegated to the B-list, staring down the barrel of her mid-30s with the terrifying, cold realization that her window for achieving true historical prominence was rapidly slamming shut. The inner pressure during this Canadian exile must have been practically unbearable, a simmering, toxic resentment that she was starring in a Canadian-filmed ensemble cast rather than gracing the prestigious covers of international Vogue, forcing her to painfully accept that her acting career alone would never, ever be the vehicle to deliver the absolute supremacy she craved. It was this precise, volatile cocktail of moderate financial security, profound professional dissatisfaction, and an intensely honed, utterly ruthless networking ability that primed her for the ultimate, most audacious pivot of her entire life. Setting the stage for a transatlantic operation, she recognized with the chilling, absolute clarity of a seasoned social predator that if the fiercely guarded entertainment industry would not crown her as undeniable royalty, she would simply have to cross the ocean and infiltrate the real thing, setting her sights firmly and unapologetically on a vulnerable, emotionally fractured prince who possessed the precise global platform she so desperately required. We arrive inevitably at the highly orchestrated collision of two entirely disparate trajectories, the precise moment when a moderately successful cable television actress, armed with years of aggressive social climbing, finally locked her sights on the ultimate, unimaginably lucrative prize. To understand the sheer velocity of this capture, one must first examine the profound, aching psychological vulnerability of Prince Harry during the summer of 2016, a man who, despite his immense privilege and global adoration as the beloved, cheeky rogue of the royal family, was fundamentally adrift and desperately searching for a permanent anchor. He was a deeply traumatized individual, still visibly carrying the heavy, unresolved grief of his mother's tragic passing, while simultaneously grappling with the suffocating existential dread of the spare dynamic as he watched Prince William and Catherine effortlessly build out the future of the monarchy. Into this vast, aching, emotional void stepped a woman who had spent the better part of a decade meticulously honing the art of the chameleon. A seasoned Hollywood operator who instantly recognized the unprecedented opportunity presenting itself in the form of a lonely, emotionally fragile royal. Her inner monologue during this period must have been a dizzying, intoxicating thrill of the chase, a supreme realization that the grueling years of networking in dimly lit Soho house corridors were finally about to yield a dividend beyond her wildest, most audacious Los Angeles dreams. She did not merely see a prince, she saw a globally recognized, impeccably branded life raft that could instantaneously transport her from the frustrating, crowded fringes of the entertainment industry directly into the hallowed, untouchable center of global historical relevance. The heavily pedaled, relentlessly romanticized narrative of their initial meeting, the charmingly naive, blind date, where she purportedly knew absolutely nothing about the British royal family, is a fairy tale that demands a heavy dose of our characteristic, grounded skepticism. A well-placed source has long maintained that this introduction at the Dean Street townhouse in London was anything but a spontaneous stroke of serendipitous luck, but rather a meticulously arranged collision facilitated by a tight-knit circle of elite fixers who understood precisely what both parties were desperately seeking. The atmosphere within that velvet-roped, intensely private sanctuary was heavy with the intoxicating, secretive energy of two worlds colliding, completely shielded from the probing, ravenous lenses of the British tabloid press that typically documented the prince's every waking move. As they sat across from one another, sipping expensive cocktails in the manufactured privacy of an exclusive members club, she executed a flawless, highly calculated performance, presenting herself not as a grasping actress, but as a grounded, fiercely intelligent humanitarian whose passions miraculously mirrored his own. One can easily picture the absolute intoxicating triumph she felt as she watched the prince lean in, thoroughly entranced by this exotic, confident American who appeared utterly unfazed by his title, a brilliant, calculated indifference that is often the most effective bait for a man entirely accustomed to fawning sycophants. It was a masterclass in psychological capture, a delicate, ruthless mirroring of his deepest desires and insecurities, ensuring that by the time they parted ways that evening, the hook was not merely set, but deeply, irretrievably embedded into his psyche. This initial, electrifying connection was rapidly accelerated under the vast, starlit canopy of Botswana, a pivotal, highly secluded trip that served to permanently cement their bond far away from the stifling, ancient protocols of the palace and the cynical gaze of the London establishment. The atmosphere of the African bush provided the absolute perfect, romanticized backdrop for the next phase of her operation, offering an intoxicating bubble of isolation where reality was suspended, and they could exist in a pristine, heavily idealized vacuum of their own making. For Prince Harry, the crackling campfires and the sweeping, silent plains offered a profound, desperately needed illusion of absolute safety and normalcy, a fleeting, precious environment where he felt he was finally being seen as a man rather than a highly scrutinized institutional figurehead. Meanwhile, for the woman who would become the Duchess, the inner experience was undoubtedly one of supreme calculated validation as she seamlessly adapted to the rugged environment, playing the role of the earthy, low-maintenance companion to absolute perfection, all while acutely aware that she was successfully reeling in the most famous bachelor on the face of the earth. She masterfully utilized the profound silence and the breathtaking isolation of the wilderness to weave herself inextricably into his vision of the future, establishing herself as the singular, indispensable confidant who alone truly understood the heavy, unbearable burdens of his royal existence. It was beneath those African stars that the fatal, deeply tragic narrative was truly born. The toxic, intensely codependent idea that it was the two of them united against a cold, unfeeling world, a romanticized bunker mentality that would eventually be used to justify the destruction of his entire previous life. The long-term consequences of this whirlwind, intensely secretive courtship began to manifest almost immediately upon their return to civilization. as the deliberate, systematic dismantling of the prince's existing support network was quietly but ruthlessly initiated under the guise of protecting their newfound, supposedly sacred bond. A source within the inner circle observed with mounting silent horror as lifelong friends, trusted aides, and loyal confidants who had stood by Harry through his darkest, most turbulent years were suddenly, inexplicably frozen out, deemed either insufficiently supportive or inherently threatening to the new, absolute authority of his American girlfriend. This chilling, highly effective isolation tactic is a hallmark of those who seek total emotional dominance, creating a suffocatingly tight echo chamber where the only acceptable, validating voice belonged exclusively to her, fundamentally severing his ties to any grounded, objective reality. His inner emotional landscape shifted from one of expansive, boisterous camaraderie to a paranoid, fiercely guarded devotion, entirely consumed by the desperate, frantic need to protect this new relationship from the perceived, constantly manufactured threats lurking around every corner of his former life. By entirely monopolizing his trust and meticulously framing his family and friends as part of a toxic, archaic machine that sought to destroy them, she effectively neutralized any potential dissenting voices before they could even sound the alarm. He was completely, tragically blind to the reality that in his desperate, entirely understandable quest to finally find a haven of unconditional love, he had inadvertently handed the absolute keys to his future and the long-term stability of the monarchy itself over to a woman whose primary loyalty had always been, and would always remain, entirely to herself. We move now from the intoxicating, heavily shielded bubble of their African courtship into the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of their formal engagement, a period where the initial charming veneer began to crack violently under the immense weight of centuries-old royal machinery. It was during this exact, highly scrutinized transition that the true nature of her ambition crystallized, transforming from the vague, scrambling aspirations of a Hollywood climber into the concrete, tangible reality of securing an official, globally recognized royal title. The atmosphere within the ancient, hallowed corridors of the palace during these initial planning stages was thick with a very specific, suffocating apprehension, a quiet, dawning realization among the old guard that they were dealing with an entirely unprecedented, deeply disruptive force. A well-placed source has recently revealed a rather telling, almost comical detail from behind closed doors, noting that upon being formally informed she would be styled as a duchess, she practically leapt out of her seat with a palpable, intoxicating triumph that thoroughly unsettled the seasoned courtiers present in the room. Her inner emotional state at that precise moment must have been one of absolute euphoric vindication, the staggering realization that the ultimate prize was finally, firmly in her grasp, and that she had successfully catapulted herself into the absolute zenith of global aristocracy. The sheer, naked excitement over acquiring a fancy title, rather than a solemn, grounded understanding of the heavy, lifelong duty of public service it actually entailed, was the very first glaring red flag that she viewed the British monarchy merely as the ultimate, glittering extension of her own personal brand. This profound, fundamental misunderstanding of her new role immediately manifested in a brutal, exhausting clash of cultures behind the scenes, effectively turning the usually serene, highly organized palace operations into a daily grinding battlefield of ego and unwarranted entitlement. She arrived not with the quiet, respectful eagerness to learn the delicate, centuries-old intricacies of royal protocol, but rather with the aggressive, demanding swagger of a mid-tier Hollywood diva who firmly believed she had been hired to completely modernize and star in a tired, dusty, theatrical production. The inner atmosphere of the royal offices rapidly deteriorated into one of profound, suffocating tension and genuine dread, as dedicated professionals who had served the crown with quiet dignity for decades suddenly found themselves subjected to pre-dawn emails, abrasive demands, and a distinctly Californian corporate ruthlessness. A source within the inner circle has painted a deeply distressing picture of those chaotic months leading up to the wedding, detailing how seasoned, well-meaning staff members were routinely reduced to tears, entirely broken down by her relentless, uncompromising insistence that her every whim be accommodated instantaneously. It was a terrifying, exhausting environment where the traditional, deeply ingrained palace ethos of duty and discretion was aggressively replaced by a toxic, highly combustible culture of constant grievance and theatrical dissatisfaction. Her internal monologue during these relentless clashes was undoubtedly fueled by a deeply arrogant conviction that she was the smartest, most capable person in any room, utterly blind to the reality that her aggressive bulldozer tactics were alienating the very people whose expertise she desperately needed to survive in her new, highly complex reality. Naturally, the devastating, chaotic ripple effects of this tempestuous behavior did not escape the fiercely protective, highly observant eye of Prince William, a man deeply aware of his future destiny as king and fundamentally committed to preserving the stability and dignity of the institution at all costs. As the disturbing reports of staff mistreatment and her astonishingly abrasive demeanor began to quietly filter up through the ranks, his inner emotional landscape shifted from one of cautious brotherly optimism to a rising icy dread regarding the woman his younger brother was frantically preparing to marry. He attempted, with the quiet, measured diplomacy befitting his station and his deep familial love, to gently urge Prince Harry to simply slow down, to allow this remarkably forceful American actress more time to genuinely acclimate to the bizarre, incredibly demanding reality of life within the firm before committing to a lifelong union. However, the atmosphere between the two brothers, once characterized by a legendary, unbreakable camaraderie forged in the tragic fires of their shared childhood trauma, instantly curdled into a tense, highly defensive standoff that would ultimately alter the course of royal history. Prince Harry, completely ensnared in the intoxicating, fiercely protective narrative that it was the two of them against a cruel, unfeeling world, interpreted his brother's perfectly reasonable, highly prescient caution as a direct, hostile attack on his ultimate happiness. The catastrophic, long-term consequence of this initial, highly charged confrontation was the creation of the very first irreversible hairline fractures in their relationship, a deeply tragic severing of trust that she masterfully exploited to further isolate her future husband from the only family that had ever truly known him. We must now turn our discerning eyes to the grand, glittering spectacle of a balmy May morning at Windsor, a day that was furiously packaged and sold to the global public as the ultimate modern fairy tale, yet which, upon closer inspection, more closely resembled the most expensive, heavily directed pilot episode ever produced for television. The atmosphere surrounding the ancient, sun-drenched stones of St. George's Chapel was a dizzying, profoundly jarring juxtaposition of solemn, thousand-year-old British history crashing headlong into the slick, aggressively curated energy of a Hollywood red carpet premiere. For the bride, ensconced in hundreds of thousands of pounds of bespoke Givenchy silk and radiating a highly rehearsed, beatific smile, her inner emotional state was undoubtedly one of supreme, intoxicating satisfaction, having finally secured the ultimate leading role on the grandest, most untouchable stage the world has to offer. She was no longer a struggling cable actress hustling for screen time or furiously networking in dimly lit Soho house corridors. She had successfully transformed herself into a global icon in a matter of hours, commanding the breathless attention of billions while flanked by the absolute pinnacle of the British establishment. The sheer theatricality of her slow, deliberate procession down the nave, bathed in the ethereal light of stained glass, was a masterclass in performative grace, yet beneath the heavy veil, one could almost sense the cold, calculating machinery of a woman who fully understood that she had just executed the most spectacular, audacious social coup of the 21st century. It was a flawless, highly polished illusion of radiant humility, a performance so utterly convincing that it momentarily blinded the world to the deep structural fractures that had already begun to splinter the institution behind those heavy oak doors. However, if one possessed the wherewithal to look past the dazzling, multi-million-pound floral arrangements and the rousing, meticulously selected gospel choir, the glaring, utterly bizarre reality of the carefully curated guest list offered a chilling premonition of the ruthless emotional severing that was to come. In an unprecedented, deeply unsettling departure from every known tradition of matrimony, let alone a royal one, the bride's side of the ancient chapel was entirely devoid of any familial warmth, save for the solitary, silent presence of her mother, Doria. Instead of childhood friends, extended relatives, or those who had supported her through her lean, struggling years in Los Angeles, the pews were strategically packed with an absolute phalanx of Hollywood A-listers, including Oprah Winfrey and the Clooneys, individuals who, a source behind closed doors has wryly confirmed, she barely knew at the time, but who provided the precise elite aesthetic she demanded for her global broadcast. The atmosphere among the established aristocracy and the seasoned courtiers present was one of polite, highly repressed bewilderment, as they watched a woman entirely erase her own personal history in real time, casually replacing her actual flesh and blood with highly influential, glittering strangers who could be of significant use to her future ambitions. This breathtaking, theatrical display of social climbing, disguised as a wedding party, revealed an inner emotional landscape entirely devoid of authentic, grounded attachments, entirely governed instead by a ruthless transactional calculus where human beings are selected and displayed exclusively for their brand value. The long-term consequence of this very public, permanent discarding of her past was an immediate, unbridgeable chasm of distrust among those who genuinely understood the vital, grounding importance of family, clearly signaling that anyone, regardless of their history or loyalty, could and would be ruthlessly excised if they did not perfectly align with her relentlessly ambitious narrative. Amidst this swirling, highly orchestrated sea of celebrity and calculated optics, we must spare a thought for the profound, quiet dignity of King Charles, who graciously, and perhaps entirely against his own deeply buried instincts, stepped in to walk his future daughter-in-law down the aisle when her own father was dramatically and conveniently sidelined. The inner emotions of the king on that day were undoubtedly a complex, deeply conflicted mixture of genuine paternal concern for his younger, famously fragile son and a resolute, stoic commitment to maintaining the serene, unified facade of the monarchy in front of a ravenous global audience. Someone close to palace circles has often reflected that His Majesty made a truly Herculean effort to welcome this disruptive American force into the fold, entirely ignoring the alarming reports of her pre-wedding tantrums and the infamous explosive arguments over tiaras that had left the late Queen's trusted dressmakers entirely shell-shocked. The atmosphere he attempted to foster was one of profound ancient inclusion, offering her the protective, deeply symbolic arm of the future monarch in a desperate, touching bid to bridge the vast, yawning cultural chasm that was already threatening to tear his family apart. Yet, as he guided her toward the altar, enveloped in the soaring, majestic music of the chapel, one cannot help but suspect that beneath his warm, highly practiced smile, he harbored a chilling, prescient realization that this woman was not walking toward a life of quiet, dutiful service, but rather ascending the steps of a platform she intended to completely dominate and ultimately destroy. His gracious, historic gesture of patriarchal support was ruthlessly pocketed as yet another prop in her grand, self-aggrandizing narrative, entirely unappreciated for the profound, almost desperate olive branch it truly represented from an institution already buckling under the weight of her demands. The immediate, long-term consequence of this spectacularly staged Windsor theatrical production was the creation of a massive, profoundly dangerous false dawn, an intoxicating, glittering illusion that completely seduced the British public and the global press into believing they were witnessing the dawn of a fresh, modernizing era for the ancient firm. The world was utterly captivated by the romance, the diversity, and the sheer, undeniable glamour of the event, willingly blinding themselves to the mounting, irrefutable evidence that they were merely applauding the opening act of a highly destructive, fundamentally self-serving Hollywood tragedy. This public adoration served only to fatally inflate the newly minted Duchess's already staggering ego, feeding her inner, deeply entrenched belief that she was the absolute savior of a dusty, archaic institution that desperately needed her unique, Californian brand of progressive enlightenment. The atmosphere in the immediate aftermath of the carriage procession was one of triumphant, dizzying relief from the palace press offices, who desperately hoped that the beautiful, flawless execution of the day would finally quell the screaming matches and soothe the bride's relentless, combative nature. Sadly, as we now so agonizingly know, the fairy tale was nothing more than a temporary, highly expensive ceasefire, a beautifully lit, expertly directed mirage that merely masked the bitter institutional warfare that was about to erupt behind the heavy, gilded gates of Kensington Palace once the cameras were finally switched off and the A-list guests had flown back to their mansions. We were not watching the joyful, harmonious blending of two distinct worlds, my friends. We were entirely unwitting spectators to a hostile, meticulously planned corporate takeover, dressed up in white silk and diamond tiaras, signaling the absolute catastrophic end of Prince Harry's life as he had ever known it. The confetti had barely been swept from the cobbled, historic streets of Windsor before the magnificent, heavily televised illusion began its rapid, deeply spectacular unraveling, plunging the monarchy into a period of unprecedented, grinding internal warfare that would forever alter the fabric of the institution. The newly minted Sussexes retreated to the sprawling, taxpayer-funded confines of Frogmore Cottage, an environment that almost immediately metastasized from a promised idyllic domestic haven into a claustrophobic, deeply paranoid bunker, increasingly isolated from the very family that sustained their immense global platform. The atmosphere within those ancient walls was notoriously stifling, thick with an almost unbearable, continuously manufactured suspicion that the rest of the royal family and the seasoned courtiers were actively, maliciously conspiring against their unparalleled brilliance and progressive modernism. For a woman who had spent her entire, fiercely ambitious adult life aggressively hustling for the absolute top spot on the Hollywood call sheet, her inner emotional state upon realizing the brutal, unyielding reality of the royal hierarchy must have been one of simmering, absolutely incandescent resentment. She was indeed a duchess, draped in the finest bespoke couture and dripping in borrowed jewels, but she was entirely permanently relegated to a supporting role, structurally positioned behind Prince William and Catherine by the immovable laws of succession, a bitter, utterly intolerable pill that no amount of Californian self-actualization could possibly sweeten. A source within the inner circle has noted that the quiet, frosty rebukes from the old guard regarding her flagrant, entirely deliberate disregard for established protocol were not received as helpful, necessary guidance, but rather weaponized internally as irrefutable evidence of a grand institutional vendetta against her. The long-term consequence of this profound, egocentric inability to accept her secondary status within the firm was the immediate fatal poisoning of the familial well, ensuring that absolutely every subsequent interaction with the palace was viewed entirely through a distorted, highly defensive lens of perpetual victimhood. This toxic, perpetually aggrieved internal narrative rapidly spilt over into the daily management of their royal household, precipitating an absolute, unprecedented exodus of terrified aides and seasoned professionals who found themselves caught in the relentless, exhausting crossfire of her demands. We must speak frankly about the so-called Sussex Survivors Club, a grim, highly revealing moniker adopted by the string of talented, incredibly loyal staff members who were systematically broken down by a workplace culture that a source behind closed doors has described as emotionally ruinous, deeply volatile, and entirely devoid of basic professional empathy. The atmosphere within their Kensington Palace offices before the great, highly publicized separation of households was fundamentally governed by sheer fear, a terrifying, unpredictable environment where early morning emails and blistering, entirely unwarranted reprimands became the exhausting, deeply demoralizing norm. One can only imagine the sheer, frantic inner panic of these dedicated civil servants, individuals who had devoted their entire careers to the quiet, dignified service of the crown, suddenly finding themselves subjected to the aggressive corporate ruthlessness of a minor actress who firmly believed that common courtesy was entirely optional for someone of her newly acquired towering rank. Prince Harry, rather than gently, firmly reining in his wife's catastrophic mismanagement of their team, instead tragically enabled it with a misplaced, almost adolescent sense of chivalry. His own inner paranoia stoked to an absolute fever pitch by her constant, highly orchestrated whispers that the staff were deliberately, institutionally failing them. The devastating consequence of this brutal, high-handed treatment was the total, irreversible alienation of the very courtiers who were best equipped to guide them through the treacherous, deeply complex waters of royal life, leaving the couple dangerously isolated and relying solely on the sycophantic, deeply inexperienced advice of aggressive American PR executives. The absolute climax of this meticulously constructed, utterly self-serving victim narrative was executed with breathtaking, deeply cynical precision during the royal tour of South Africa, an expedition initially designed by the palace to highlight profound, genuine humanitarian issues across the continent. Instead of utilizing this immense, taxpayer-funded global platform to elevate the desperate plight of the impoverished, incredibly vulnerable communities they were ostensibly visiting, the Duchess ruthlessly seized the opportunity to dramatically center the narrative entirely upon her own, supposedly unbearable suffering in a masterclass of theatrical manipulation. The atmosphere during that infamous, highly orchestrated interview with Tom Bradby was heavily pregnant with calculated melancholy, as she stood against the backdrop of one of the most disadvantaged regions on Earth, and tragically, tearfully bemoaned that "not many people have asked if I'm okay." A stunning, profoundly tone-deaf performance that left the British public entirely aghast. Her inner monologue at that precise moment was undoubtedly one of supreme strategic triumph, fully aware that she was deliberately bypassing the established royal press machinery to speak directly to an emotional, heavily Americanized audience, expertly positioning herself as a fragile, bullied martyr, actively surviving a cold, unfeeling British institution. Someone close to palace circles has indicated that the reaction back in London was one of absolute cold fury, as King Charles and Prince William watched, entirely paralyzed, while the very fabric of the monarchy's stoic, duty-bound ethos was publicly shredded for cheap daytime television sympathy. The catastrophic long-term consequence of this televised betrayal was the immediate, unceremonious dropping of the veil. It became undeniably, agonizingly clear to the senior royals that they were no longer dealing with a difficult, merely demanding family member, but rather with a highly destructive, deeply hostile foreign entity operating entirely outside the boundaries of institutional loyalty. The inevitable, spectacular culmination of this relentless, exhausting campaign of grievance was the unprecedented, deeply chaotic flight to North America, a move famously dubbed Megxit, which was executed with the kind of aggressive, underhanded corporate strategy one typically associates with a hostile boardroom takeover rather than a familial separation. They effectively ambushed the late Queen and the King with a hastily published, highly arrogant manifesto on Instagram, demanding a deeply absurd, entirely unworkable, half-in, half-out model that would allow them to ruthlessly commercialize their royal titles globally while entirely shirking the tedious, unglamorous domestic duties of public service. The atmosphere at the hastily convened Sandringham summit was reportedly one of profound, icy resolve, as the monarch and her heirs firmly, unequivocally rejected this audacious, deeply insulting proposition, drawing a permanent, unyielding line in the sand that utterly shocked the profoundly arrogant couple. Prince Harry's inner emotional state during these brutal, finalizing negotiations must have been one of absolute tearing agony, realizing entirely too late that his desperate, misguided attempt to appease his wife's insatiable, limitless ambitions had resulted in the total, catastrophic loss of his cherished military patronages and his rightful place within the only world he had ever truly known. Conversely, for the woman waiting safely across the Atlantic, her inner feeling was undeniably one of absolute, unadulterated victory, having successfully extracted a highly recognizable, infinitely marketable prince from his protective fortress, entirely free to monetize his profound trauma in the sun-drenched, morally bankrupt valleys of California. The long-term, devastating consequence of this grand fracture was the permanent institutional hardening of the royal family against them, forever closing the heavy oak doors on the Sussexes and leaving them stranded on an immensely wealthy, yet profoundly isolated island of their own making, armed with nothing but a shrinking reservoir of bitter, highly repetitive complaints. Fast forward through the intervening years of relentless, highly paid victimhood and meticulously televised score settling, and we find ourselves squarely in the present day of February 2026, staring at the rather grim, deeply uninspiring reality of their grand Californian liberation. The soaring, incredibly lucrative rhetoric of global compassion, anti-racism, and unparalleled progressive leadership has slowly, agonizingly evaporated, leaving in its wake nothing but a frantic, deeply cynical scramble to monetize the rapidly depreciating asset of their royal connection. The atmosphere surrounding their sprawling, aggressively beige Montecito estate is no longer one of triumphant, billionaire-adjacent defiance, but rather a hollow, artificially curated desperation, as the sheer, terrifying cost of maintaining an international security detail and a bloated Hollywood lifestyle begins to bite with undeniable ferocity. It is a profoundly jarring spectacle to witness a woman who once commanded the undivided attention of the Commonwealth, now furiously pivoting to the deeply saturated, inherently trivial world of celebrity lifestyle brands, desperately attempting to package and sell the very domestic bliss she so famously claimed was impossible to achieve within the confines of the palace. One can only imagine the sheer, exhausting inner turmoil of maintaining this flawlessly filtered, sun-drenched facade of California thriving, all while acutely, painfully aware that the global audience is no longer watching with breathless admiration, but rather with a distinctly amused, highly skeptical raised eyebrow. The long-term consequence of completely untethering themselves from the ancient grounding majesty of the monarchy is glaringly apparent. They have traded the profound, enduring weight of historical significance for the fleeting, incredibly fickle metrics of Instagram engagement and the merciless, unyielding demands of the commercial marketplace. We must, of course, cast our highly critical gaze upon the centerpiece of this current, rather tragic commercial era. The launch of her heavily anticipated, yet universally mocked, as ever lifestyle ventures, a deeply unoriginal foray into peddling bespoke domesticity to an increasingly indifferent public. The grand unveiling of her Napa Valley sparkling wine, inexplicably infused with raspberries, alongside overpriced chocolates and an array of terribly unremarkable burgundy slip dresses, reads less like the masterstroke of a brilliant billionaire mogul and more like the frantic end-of-aisle clearance sale of a deeply confused brand. A source behind closed doors has practically howled with laughter at the sheer, unadulterated hubris of the entire operation, noting that the painfully staged, softly lit promotional photography feels incredibly lame, entirely devoid of genuine warmth, and reeks of a woman desperately, hopelessly trying to single-handedly reinvent the concept of a dinner party. The inner emotional state driving this bizarre scattergun approach to retail is undoubtedly one of spiraling, quiet panic, a profound, agonizing realization that her name alone is no longer sufficient to guarantee the uncritical, rapturous adulation she firmly believes she is owed by the consuming public. She demands to be universally revered as the ultimate, effortlessly chic domestic goddess, a modern-day Martha Stewart with a royal crest. Yet she is continually, brutally confronted with the humiliating reality that the market views her offerings as deeply inauthentic. Cynically priced cash grabs entirely divorced from any relatable reality. The suffocating atmosphere of her carefully guarded, sycophantic inner circle clearly prevents anyone from delivering the harsh, necessary truth that slapping a coronet on a bottle of pink fizz does not instantly elevate it to the realm of high luxury, but rather aggressively highlights the profound, deeply embarrassing desperation of the vendor. This relentless, unapologetic monetization of the Duchess title fundamentally represents the absolute, ultimate cheapening of the Sussex name, an irreversible degradation from the solemn, dignified heights of international statecraft down to the brassy, high-volume hustle of a late-night television infomercial. When one critically examines the vast, heartbreaking chasm between the dignified, centuries-old legacy of the British royal family and the current, deeply undignified spectacle of aggressively marketing jam and sleepwear on social media, the sheer scale of the tragedy becomes breathtakingly apparent. The inner monologue of Prince Harry, watching his beloved, incredibly protective wife utilize the title bestowed upon them by his late grandmother to hawk chocolate truffles, must be a complicated, deeply suppressed knot of cognitive dissonance, and perhaps a quiet, dawning shame he dares not articulate even to himself. He was raised within an institution that explicitly, fundamentally prohibits the vulgar commercialization of its ancient honors, yet he now finds himself entirely complicit in an operation that ruthlessly strip-mines his family's heritage for every available, rapidly diminishing Californian dollar. A well-meaning staff member from their past has sorrowfully observed that this was always the inevitable, disastrous trajectory once the protective, restraining guardrails of the palace were violently removed, leaving a woman with limitless ambition but absolutely no institutional boundaries to aggressively commodify the very institution she simultaneously claims nearly destroyed her. The devastating permanent consequence of this jam and wine era is the total, irreversible loss of their remaining mystique. They are no longer enigmatic, exiled royals fighting for a noble cause, but merely another pair of exceedingly wealthy, profoundly out-of-touch influencers frantically begging the public to click the link in their bio before the money finally runs out. It is not merely their chaotic foray into domestic merchandising that has collapsed into a heap of public ridicule. As we critically survey the smoking ruins of their broader Californian commercial empire, it becomes painfully evident that their aggressive, highly publicized pivot to Hollywood production has resulted in a spectacular, utterly humiliating freeze-out by the very elite they so desperately sought to court. The atmosphere within the sprawling, increasingly isolated Archewell offices is reportedly one of perpetual frantic crisis, characterized by a dizzying revolving door of seasoned executives who rapidly realize that working for the couple involves navigating a deeply volatile, structurally unsound vanity project rather than a legitimate, functioning production company. Someone close to palace circles has wryly noted that the recent, highly embarrassing cancellation of her heavily promoted Netflix animated project, alongside their profoundly awkward, visibly tense appearance at independent film festivals to peddle yet another ill-conceived venture, signals the absolute death knell of their Hollywood credibility. For the Duchess, the inner emotional landscape during these cascading professional failures is undoubtedly one of spiraling, white-hot panic, a terrifying, agonizing realization that her immense, carefully constructed victim narrative fundamentally lacks the substantive creative talent required to sustain a multi-million-dollar entertainment empire. She is desperately, furiously searching for a scapegoat to absorb the crushing weight of public mockery and industry rejection, refusing entirely to accept that her own abrasive, uncompromising management style and profound lack of original vision are the true, undeniable architects of this disastrous commercial collapse. The long-term, devastating consequence of this brutal industry rejection is their complete, undeniable banishment to the absolute fringes of the A-list, leaving them commercially toxic, professionally stranded, and staring into the terrifying abyss of their own rapidly diminishing relevance in a town that aggressively punishes failure. This frantic, desperate need to offload the blame for their spectacularly crumbling brand has invariably, and quite tragically, landed squarely upon the stooping shoulders of the prince himself, fundamentally shifting the toxic power dynamic within their deeply isolated Montecito compound to one of sheer, unadulterated dominance. The atmosphere behind the heavily fortified doors of their Californian mansion is notoriously fraught with tense, fiery rows as she ruthlessly points the finger at his declining public popularity, his exhausting, repetitive legal battles, and his enduring trauma as the primary anchors dragging her supposedly limitless, billion-dollar potential into the dirt. A source behind closed doors has whispered of his quiet, dawning realization of his own profoundly diminished worth within her cold commercial calculus, as he watches his fiercely protective, supposedly egalitarian partner continuously sideline him in favor of her own increasingly desperate, tightly controlled solo ventures. His inner emotional state must be one of profound, suffocating capitulation, realizing with a sickening dread that he willingly traded the loving, fiercely protective embrace of a centuries-old institution for a deeply subservient, heavily managed supporting role in a failing Hollywood startup, where his only remaining value is his rapidly depreciating royal title. This agonizing subjugation is glaringly obvious in her absolute, iron-fisted dominance over the family narrative, callously ignoring his well-documented, practically pathological pleas for absolute privacy by strategically posting their children on social media the very moment she requires a cynical, sugary distraction from her latest business humiliation. The devastating consequence of this total surrender of his agency is the complete, permanent loss of control over his own destiny, leaving him isolated, creatively castrated, and inextricably bound to a woman who views him less as a cherished husband and more as a deeply frustrating, highly depreciated corporate asset that is failing to yield a return on her investment. The sheer, humiliating depth of their current, self-inflicted exile is perhaps most perfectly encapsulated by the deeply embarrassing, heavily rumored attempts of Prince Andrew to reach across the Atlantic, desperately seeking a bizarre alliance of disgraced non-working royal spares, an overture that the Duchess reportedly views with absolute visceral disgust. The atmosphere surrounding these supposed communications is thick with a desperate, incredibly unseemly scrambling for relevance, yet it brutally highlights the stark, unavoidable reality that the Sussexes have spectacularly reduced themselves to the absolute lowest, most scandalous rungs of the royal periphery, entirely stripped of their former untouchable majesty. For a woman whose inner monologue has always been entirely consumed by delusions of supreme global grandeur and unparalleled historical importance, the terrifying realization that her meticulously planned exit has resulted in them being institutionally grouped with the most toxic, universally reviled figures in modern royal history must be a jagged, practically unbearable pill to swallow. It is the ultimate, profoundly tragic consequence of their shared, staggering hubris, a permanent, undeniable legacy of trading a profound lifetime duty to the Commonwealth for the shallow, fleeting, and ultimately entirely unforgiving glare of the Californian sun, completely severing their ties to the only family capable of offering them true protection. We are witnessing the final melancholy act of a deeply vulnerable prince who foolishly surrendered an ancient, glorious kingdom for a hollow illusion, and a ruthlessly ambitious duchess who successfully captured the global spotlight only to aggressively, systematically prove to the world that she never possessed the grace, the humility, or the substance to actually hold it. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write. And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth.